Detective Marple, the Fairchild conspiracy, a murder mystery you won't forget. A Miss Marple mystery pastiche. Welcome, dear listener, to another tale woven with mystery, thriller, and suspense. A story that promises to intrigue and captivate. Shall we begin? Act 1. An invitation to Meadowbank Hall. The sun was warm, the scent of roses thick in the air, and the bees, blessedly, minding their own business. Agatha Marple sat in her garden, a cup of tea cooling on the armrest of her wicker chair, knitting needles clicking in practised rhythm. She was the kind of woman who noticed things. Small, quiet things that others let slip by. It wasn't a habit, exactly, more of an affliction. She had just finished a particularly tricky row of pearl stitches when the postman came trundling up the lane. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Got something for you." "Afternoon, Henry," she said, plucking the envelope from his ink-stained fingers. The paper was heavy, the sort that felt like money, not quite perfume, but not far off. Meadowbank Hall, Lady Helena Fairchild. She turned it over, slid a slim finger under the wax seal, and unfolded the letter. "My dearest Agatha, it has been far too long since we last saw one another. I do hope you'll indulge an old friend and spend the weekend with us at Meadowbank Hall. We're hosting a small gathering, just family and a few close acquaintances. You will be doing me a great kindness by coming. Your presence, I feel, will be most reassuring. Yours ever, Helena." Reassuring. Miss Marple tapped the edge of the letter against her knee. There was a weight to those words, a faint shiver of distress hidden beneath the pleasantries. She had known Lady Helena long enough to recognize when something was being politely swept under a Persian rug, and when a woman of means started asking for reassurance, it usually meant trouble. A slight breeze rustled the hydrangeas. She took a sip of her tea. Cold. "Well," she murmured, folding the letter with crisp precision, "that does sound promising." Packing up and setting off inside, the air was cool with the scent of lavender sachets tucked into linen. Miss Marple packed lightly. 2 dresses, a sensible hat, a sturdy pair of walking shoes. She'd learned long ago that trouble wasn't much impressed by fashion. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, stood in the doorway with a damp dish-rag in her hand. "Going away, then?" "Only for the weekend," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Davies frowned. "Meadowbank Hall? That great big place?" "The very same. I wouldn't set foot in it if they were handing out gold watches at the door. Bad business there, mark my words." Miss Marple gave her a look. "What sort of bad business?" The housekeeper wiped at a non-existent stain on her apron. "Oh, I wouldn't know," she said, in the way of people who very much do. "Just stories, whispers. Not the sort of place for a lady on her own." Miss Marple smiled, tucking her gloves into her handbag. "Then it's fortunate I never quite fit that description." She stepped out into the sunlight, the handle of her small valise warm under her fingers. The carriage had been sent ahead for her, a polished black affair driven by a young man who looked like he had barely learned to shave. He tipped his cap. "Miss Marple, ma'am, I'm from Meadowbank. Lady Fairchild sent me to fetch you." "Oh, considerate of her," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. The door shut with a firm click. As the carriage trundled down the village road, the hedgerows thick with spring's first green, Miss Marple leaned back against the seat. A weekend in a grand old house, polite conversation, a letter laced with quiet distress. Oh yes, it had all the makings of something rather interesting. The carriage rolled up the winding drive, tires crunching over gravel in a steady rhythm. Miss Marple watched from her seat as Meadowbank Hall came into view, its stately facade gleaming under the afternoon sun. The house was the sort of place built by men who had never doubted their own importance. Tall, symmetrical, with great oak doors large enough to swallow a man whole. Beyond the gravelled drive, the sprawling lawns stretched out like a well-kept secret. A row of yew hedges, clipped to stern perfection, lined the approach, the sort of place where money whispered instead of shouted, where wealth wore a quiet, knowing smile. As the carriage slowed, the staff moved with purpose. 2 footmen stood ready at the entrance, one adjusting his gloves with a faint air of boredom. Near the side of the house, a young woman in a maid's uniform hurried across the path, balancing a silver tray with the urgency of someone who knew what a broken teacup could cost her. Miss Marple stepped down from the carriage with the ease of a woman who knew how to navigate society's edges. Captain Leonard Winslow was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps. "Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat. "Welcome to Meadowbank." The captain was a man built for standing at attention. His military posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, expression carefully neutral. His hair, dark with the first signs of grey at the temples, was neatly combed back. The kind of man who had once been dangerous in all the right ways, and now carried himself like he wasn't quite sure where to put his hands. He reached for her valise. "Allow me." Miss Marple let him, noting the quick, efficient way he handled the weight. "How very chivalrous," she murmured, stepping up onto the grand stone landing. "Chivalry's about all we have left these days," Winslow replied, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Well, that and brandy." Before Miss Marple could respond, the heavy oak doors swung open. Lady Helena Fairchild stood framed in the doorway, elegant as ever, wrapped in the kind of silk that suggested its owner did not fuss over price tags. "Agatha," she said, smiling warmly, "I was afraid you'd changed your mind." "I never change my mind," Miss Marple replied. "Unless, of course, it turns out to be the wrong one." Lady Helena's smile tightened, just a fraction, a small thing, almost nothing at all. The grand entrance hall was a cathedral of polished marble and hushed wealth. A chandelier, its crystals sharp as cut diamonds, caught the afternoon light in lazy glimmers. Tall oil portraits of stern-faced Fairchild ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following visitors with the kind of practiced disdain that only old money could perfect. A house like this didn't welcome guests, it tolerated them. Lady Helena led Miss Marple through the hall with measured steps. "I've put you in the east wing," she said. "It's the quietest part of the house." Miss Marple noted the phrasing, not the most comfortable or the most scenic. "The quietest. Interesting. Very considerate of you," she said. A side door creaked open, and a man strode through, dark hair slightly tousled, a telephone receiver still in one hand. "Edward Fairchild, the heir to Meadowbank, and, by all accounts, a man with no shortage of ambition." He barely glanced at them before bringing the receiver back to his ear. Yes, I understand," he muttered, pacing toward the study. "But that's not the figure we agreed upon." Lady Helena's hand fluttered toward her pearls before she caught herself. "Edward," she said lightly. "You remember Miss Marple?" Edward stopped, looked up and managed a polite but distracted nod. "Of course. Pleasure." Miss Marple inclined her head, the sort of response a man gives when he's already thinking about his next sentence. Edward turned on his heel and disappeared into the study, closing the door with a soft but definite click. Lady Helena exhaled, just a whisper of breath, before offering Miss Marple another carefully constructed smile. "Politics," she said lightly. "Such a tiresome business." Miss Marple smiled back. "Tiresome business." Miss Marple smiled back, just as lightly. "I wouldn't know," she said, "though I imagine one must get used to stepping over bodies." Lady Helena's fingers tightened around her pearls. Another small thing. Almost nothing at all. As they passed the study, Miss Marple caught a flicker of movement. Just beyond the half-open door, a young woman lingered in the shadowed corridor. The maid from earlier, Dorothy. She stood stiffly, shoulders drawn tight, as if listening for something just beyond her reach. She noticed Miss Marple watching her, and for the briefest moment her expression twisted into something unreadable. Fear, perhaps, or something sharper. Then, in a practised movement, she curtsied low and hurried away down the hall, vanishing through a side door. Miss Marple watched the empty space she left behind. Lady Helena didn't notice, or, if she did, she pretended not to. Instead, she led Miss Marple up the grand staircase, voice lilting with hospitality. "I do hope you will find your room comfortable," she said. "I'm sure I shall," Miss Marple replied. She cast one last glance at the study door, behind which Edward Fairchild spoke in low, urgent tones. Then she followed Lady Helena up the stairs, and outside the wind shifted through the yew hedges, rustling like a whisper, like a warning. It was all there, the opulence, the charm, the carefully practiced pleasantries, and beneath it, something else, something with sharp edges and quiet shadows, a secret, or maybe a body waiting to happen. The sun draped itself lazily over Meadowbank Hall, turning the sprawling lawns into a golden spectacle of well-heeled guests and well-practiced smiles. Glasses clinked. Laughter tinkled like piano notes, just a little too high, a little too bright. Beneath the wisteria-draped arbour, a string quartet played with the quiet competence of men paid well to be ignored. The garden party was in full swing. It had all the hallmarks of wealth at play. White-clothed tables, silver platters piled high with delicacies, and uniformed staff gliding through the throng like well-trained shadows. Conversations were buoyant, yet something unspoken tightened the air. Miss Marple didn't need to squint to see it. A touch too much stiffness in the laughter, a few too many glances over shoulders, and Lady Helena Fairchild, standing near the terrace, smiling with all the warmth of a woman carefully holding something at arm's length. Miss Marple moved through the crowd, her sensible shoes whispering over the trimmed grass. She knew how to make herself invisible. A curious trait for a woman of her disposition. To be an old woman in a crowd of the ambitious was to be furniture. They saw her about as much as they saw the china teacups in their hand, which was to say, not at all. She caught snippets of conversation, bits and pieces that slid past the silk and pearl facade of the afternoon. Bradshaw's pushing too hard. The council won't stand for it. Fairchild's a smart man, but he's letting his mother pull the strings. Shouldn't be discussing this here. A rustle of skirts, a sharp inhale, the noise of something fragile nearly breaking. Miss Marple turned just in time to see Lady Helena's fingers tighten on her champagne glass. Her gaze was fixed across the garden, where her son, Edward Fairchild, stood in close conversation with a man twice his girth and half his tact. Lord Peter Bradshaw. Bradshaw was the kind of man who sounded important because he was loud enough to make it true. His suit was expensive, but just a shade too tight, his tie a bold blood red, as if he wanted people to notice how much he didn't care about subtlety. He threw his head back in laughter, the kind of laugh that didn't invite others to join in, but to admire its volume. Edward Fairchild, on the other hand, looked like a man trying to keep a wolf from chewing his leg off while making polite conversation about the weather. Miss Marple edged closer. "The Fairchild," Bradshaw said, swirling his drink with a fat finger. "You're not losing your nerve, are you?" Edward's smile was polite, the kind of polite that could cut glass. "I've no idea what you mean, Lord Bradshaw." "Oh, I think you do." Bradshaw leaned in. "This little council of yours, you're letting them get ideas that don't align with our arrangement." Edward took a slow sip of his drink, measured, thoughtful, but his fingers were white around the glass stem. "The council," he said carefully, "will do what is in the best interest of the county." Bradshaw grinned. "And you'll remind them whose interests those are, won't you?" Miss Marple didn't have to see Edward's jaw tighten to know the answer. Bradshaw turned, surveying the garden like a king surveying his kingdom. "The trouble with men like you, Fairchild," he said, "is that you think too much. Politics isn't a game of reason, it's a game of power." He took a long sip. "And I play it rather well." His voice carried, because he wanted it to. Heads turned. Lady Helena's grip on her glass turned knuckle-white. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Power. It always came back to power. And power was a game men like Bradshaw played with sharp edges. From across the garden, Lady Helena's gaze did not waver. She was not a woman given to outbursts or pleasantries. She was a woman who understood the game better than the men who thought they ran it. And yet, there was something in her posture, in the way her shoulders held too much tension, that suggested a certain anticipation. Miss Marple had seen it before. the way a hostess watches a chandelier she knows is about to fall. Miss Marple turned her attention to the maid, Dorothy, standing just beyond the terrace with a tray of empty glasses. She wasn't looking at the guests. She was looking at Edward and Bradshaw, or rather she had been. The second she caught Miss Marple watching her, she whipped her gaze down to the tray, busied herself with absolutely nothing at all. But it was too late. Miss Marple had already seen the flash of something in her eyes, fear perhaps, or maybe something far more dangerous. The garden party wore on, the music played, the guests laughed, but beneath the silk and silver, something was beginning to tighten, like a string pulled too taut, like a storm waiting to break, and Miss Marple, quiet as ever, sat back with her tea and watched the edges fray. The afternoon had mellowed into a golden haze, sunlight slipping through the wisteria like lazy fingers. Laughter and the occasional pop of champagne corks filled the garden. The orchestra played its delicate waltzes, and the guests did what guests of their station did best: smile, drink, and pretend they weren't watching one another like a pack of foxes in a henhouse. Miss Marple, comfortably settled near a rose-covered trellis, watched the crowd with the practised eye of a woman who had long ago learned that the real conversations always happened between the lines. It wasn't the loud men boasting or the ladies tittering behind their gloves that interested her. It was the way Lady Helena's fingers tightened around her champagne flute whenever Edward Fairchild spoke to Lord Bradshaw. It was the way Bradshaw's laugh landed a second too late, like a man who wasn't quite sure he was still in control of the room. And it was the way Dorothy Matthews, a slip of a girl with wide, watchful eyes, flinched like a startled bird when Bradshaw's gaze flicked over her. Dorothy moved between the guests, balancing a tray of tea and champagne with the careful grace of someone who knew better than to let her hands shake. She was a good maid, Miss Marple noted, quick, discreet, almost invisible, the type of girl who had learned that the best way to survive in a house like this was to become part of the furniture. And yet there was something off today. She wasn't quite invisible enough. Bradshaw, loud, ruddy-faced, bulging out of his expensive waistcoat like a man who'd never been told no, cut his gaze toward her as she passed. It wasn't just a glance. It was a hook, a tug of recognition. Dorothy saw it too. She stiffened ever so slightly before she caught herself. Her fingers tightened on the tray's edge, but the moment was gone before it had fully existed. She dipped her head, murmured, "Tea, my lord?" Her voice was even, polite, but Miss Marple saw the ghost of hesitation in her hand as she poured. A few drops of champagne spilled onto the tablecloth, barely noticeable unless you happened to be watching. Bradshaw smiled, slow and deliberate. "Clumsy little thing, aren't you?" Dorothy kept her gaze down, expression smooth as polished silver, and disappeared into the crowd before he could say anything more. Bradshaw took a long sip of his drink, watching her go. Miss Marple watched him watch her. And something about it didn't sit right at all. The evening stretched, the golden hues of afternoon deepening into the soft blues of dusk. The garden party was winding down, but the air was thicker now, heavier, as if the day had gathered too many secrets and didn't know where to put them. Miss Marple, seated near the veranda, caught a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. Dorothy, slipping through the side door of the house, skirts brushing against the frame like a whisper. She was moving quickly, too quickly for a girl who had nowhere to be. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A moment later, another shadow moved. Bradshaw. He stood at the garden's edge, watching the door where Dorothy had disappeared. His usual air of boorish confidence was gone, replaced by something else, something tight. His brows furrowed, his mouth set in a grim line. Then, with the unmistakable air of a man following something he wasn't quite ready to lose, he stepped inside after her. Miss Marple set down her teacup, listening to the crickets stir in the hedges. A maid slipping into the house like she didn't want to be seen. A lord following soon after, looking as though he'd misplaced something important. She had seen enough of life to know that one of them was running, and the other was hunting. The hush that settled over Meadowbank Hall was the kind that came only after too much conversation, too much wine, too many secrets balanced precariously on the edge of polite smiles. The garden party had ended, and the guests had drifted to their rooms, leaving the house in a comfortable sort of silence, the kind that should have lasted until morning. But silence, like wealth, was a fragile thing, and it didn't last. Miss Marple was settling in for the night, perched on the edge of a canopied guest bed, plucking pins from her neatly arranged hair. The glow from her bedside lamp flickered against the floral wallpaper, casting soft shadows. She had just set her silver-handled brush aside when the first sound came. A shout, distant but sharp, then a thud. Miss Marple froze, fingers curling slightly over the quilt. It wasn't the noise itself that set her heart into a steady, careful rhythm. It was the quality of it. There were sounds that belonged in a house like this. Doors closing, whispers in corridors, the occasional crash of an upended tray when a nervous maid lost her footing. This wasn't one of them. Another shout rang out, clearer this time. A man's voice, raw around the edges. "Help!" Miss Marple moved quickly, her silk dressing gown barely whispering against the floor as she stepped into the dimly lit corridor. A figure loomed ahead, Captain Winslow standing stiff-backed outside the library door, his face stark in the glow of a flickering gas lamp. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time Miss Marple saw something beneath all that military composure. Something that looked a lot like shock. The library door was open, just enough for the dark to spill into the hallway like ink. Captain Winslow stepped back, his voice tight, measured. "It's Bradshaw," he said. "He's dead." Miss Marple nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Death was never quite as surprising as it ought to be. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick, laced with a lingering scent of cigar smoke, and something else. Something that hadn't belonged there until a few minutes ago. Gunpowder. And there, sprawled across the rich Persian rug, was Lord Peter Bradshaw. His waistcoat was rumpled, his arms flung wide as if he'd been waiting to embrace someone who never came. The front of his silk evening shirt was ruined by a single, dark stain centered neatly over his chest. One bullet. Precise. Intentional. Miss Marple's gaze moved past the lax grip of one hand, resting inches from a tipped-over crystal tumbler. Brandy! Spilled. The ghost of a scent in the air. Her eyes flicked lower. Near the foot of the desk just beside Bradshaw's left shoe lay a spent bullet casing. She glanced toward the window. Closed. Latched. No sign of forced entry. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A locked room mystery, then. A moment later, Captain Winslow exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "No sign of a struggle," he murmured. Whoever did this, Bradshaw either trusted them or never saw it coming. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the bullet wound. "Oh, I rather think he saw it coming," she murmured. And if the way Bradshaw had spent the afternoon watching Dorothy, circling Edward Fairchild and speaking in veiled threats was anything to go by, he had known exactly what was coming for him. The only question left was who got to him first. The library had a way of holding on to things. The scent of tobacco and old paper, the hush of whispered threats, and now the cold weight of death. Lord Peter Bradshaw lay sprawled across the Persian rug, the fine weave drinking up the dark stain blooming from his chest. His glass of brandy lay tipped over, the amber liquid creeping into the fibres like a slow-moving ghost. The gunshot had been precise, intentional. Miss Marple noted the spent bullet casing near his shoe, the closed window, the lack of any obvious struggle. A man killed without a fight, either because he never saw it coming or because he knew the hand that pulled the trigger. Captain Winslow stood rigid by the doorway, his jaw tight. His eyes, when they met hers, were sharp and wary, the look of a man who had seen violence before but never quite grown used to it. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps from the hall, the kind that carried bad news with them. And bad news, as it turned out, had a name. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper. Mrs. Patterson was not the kind of woman to be easily shaken. 30 years in service had made sure of that, but right now, standing in the doorway, she looked like she'd walked straight into a ghost. "It's Dorothy," she said. "She's gone." Miss Marple didn't react immediately. Instead, she watched how the room absorbed those words. Lady Helena, standing near the desk, went very still. Edward Fairchild exhaled sharply, his fingers curling over the edge of a chair, and Captain Winslow, well, he merely frowned. "What do you mean, gone?" he asked. Mrs. Patterson wrung her hands, a nervous habit she'd probably broken years ago, only to have it creep back now. "She's not in her room. Her uniform is there, neatly folded, but—" She hesitated, her throat working around the words. "But there's no sign of her." The room exhaled a collective breath, shifting from shock to speculation, and then the whispers started. "Gone? In the middle of the night? She must run!" Or she was taken. Miss Marple let them talk. People revealed more when they thought they were only speculating. "She was nervous all evening," someone murmured. "She spilled champagne at the party, remember that? She was acting strange around Bradshaw." A theory was taking shape, curling around them like smoke. Dorothy was gone, and Bradshaw was dead. 1 and 1 made 2. Unless, of course, it didn't. Miss Marple smoothed a hand over her dressing gown. "She left her uniform?" she asked mildly. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "No sign of her taking anything else?" "None, miss. It's as if she just vanished." That was the part that bothered Miss Marple. Dorothy was young, clever, and careful. She wouldn't have simply vanished, not unless someone had a reason for wanting her to, and that was a very different kind of problem. The hall clock struck midnight, heavy chimes rolling through the house like an ill-timed joke. The police had arrived. Inspector Bascom was the kind of man who filled a room without ever raising his voice. He was broad-shouldered, with a face that had seen too many crimes and too few solutions. His eyes swept the library with practiced efficiency, landing briefly on Bradshaw's body, then flicking toward the guests gathered in tense clusters. "All right," he said, voice level. "No one leaves the house." A murmur rippled through the room. Protests, questions, feigned outrage. Bascom ignored them. "I need statements from everyone," he continued, "and I'll be starting with the maid." A silence. Lady Helena cleared her throat delicately. "Dorothy is missing." Bascom turned to her, his gaze sharpened. "Missing?" Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, twisting the hem of her apron. "She's not in her room, sir. Her uniform's there, but she's gone." Bascom didn't react much, just a small flicker of interest, barely noticeable. "I see," he said. Then he turned toward Miss Marple. "You were the first on the scene, weren't you?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "After Captain Winslow, yes." Bascom studied her. "And do you think the maid killed him?" A beat. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. "I think," she said, "that would be very convenient." Bascom's mouth curled slightly at the corner, the closest thing he had to a smile. Then he straightened, turning back to the body. "Lock the doors," he told his men. "Dorothy Matthews is either a murderer on the run," he let the weight of that settle before adding, "or a dead girl waiting to be found." Morning came to Meadowbank Hall with a grey sky and the scent of damp earth, as if the night's events had left their mark not only on the household, but on the weather itself. The usual hum of polite conversation over a lavish breakfast of poached eggs, kedgeree, and warm rolls was missing. Instead, the guests sat in stiff-backed silence, punctuated only by the occasional clink of silverware and the whisper of starched napkins being folded too carefully. Miss Marple, seated at the far end of the table, took in the scene with the keen eye of a woman who had long learned that silence said more than words ever could. Lady Helena sat pale and rigid, her fingers barely touching the edge of her teacup. The headache she had conveniently retired with last night seemed to have lingered into breakfast, if her pinched expression was anything to go by. Edward Fairchild was restless, pushing his food around his plate without eating. His movements were clipped, sharp, a man pacing in his mind even when his body was still. Captain Winslow had stationed himself by the hearth, posture straight, eyes sweeping the room with habitual vigilance. A man who had spent too much time leading men into battle, now trying to lead them out of suspicion, and in the far corner, half hidden behind the silver serving trolley, Mrs. Patterson stood wringing her hands, her normally stern face softened by worry. The room felt tight despite its size. A house might be grand, but when a murder settled inside it, it always felt smaller. She drank her tea in silence, letting the tension swirl around her like steam off the cup. It wasn't just grief or fear that held the room hostage. There was something else, too. Something sharper. Carefully controlled panic. It was there in the way Edward's fingers tapped against the table, in the way Lady Helena's eyes flitted toward the window, as if watching for an unseen consequence rolling toward them on the morning mist. Miss Marple let her gaze drift beyond the guests, to the staff, who moved with quiet efficiency, their faces carefully blank, their ears undoubtedly absorbing everything. When she caught one of the housemaid's eyes, the girl flushed and looked away. Dorothy had not been the kind of maid that made enemies among the staff. She had been liked, respected, if perhaps a little too quiet, a little too private, but there had been something about her that made people uneasy. And now the girl was gone. By mid-morning, Inspector Bascom had taken over the study, turning it into an unofficial interrogation room. The guests were summoned one by one, their footsteps echoing in the halls as they made their way to what was now a crime scene, wrapped in mahogany panelling and the scent of old books. Miss Marple, not one to waste time, sat just outside the study with a fresh piece of embroidery in her lap, her needle dipping in and out of the fabric at a steady rhythm. She wasn't meant to hear much, but people always underestimated an old woman with a sewing kit. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and measured. "I had a headache," she said. "I retired early. Captain Winslow was kind enough to bring me some tea." The rustle of paper, Bascom making notes. "You were in your room the entire night?" "Yes." "No visitors?" A pause, a hesitation so brief that only someone paying attention might have caught it. "Oh," she said finally, but Miss Marple outside the door could tell Bascom had caught it too. "I was on the telephone," Edward said. His voice was brisk, the voice of a man who wanted to be done with the conversation before it had begun. "With whom?" "A party official. We were discussing a—" He stopped. "A potential campaign issue." Bascom's voice didn't change, but Miss Marple knew. A disbelieving silence when she heard one. "Anyone see you?" the inspector asked. Another pause. "No." Bascom let the silence stretch. Then, "You understand, Mr. Fairchild, that makes your alibi rather unreliable." Edward's reply was too quick. "I had no reason to harm Bradshaw. A true statement, perhaps, but an irrelevant one. And irrelevant statements often meant there was something more underneath. His account was short and to the point. I heard a noise. I went to investigate. When I entered the library, Bradshaw was already dead." Bascom's chair creaked slightly. "You were the first one there?" "Yes." "Did you touch anything?" "No." Another pause. Then, "You were seen near Bradshaw earlier that evening. Did you speak with him?" A long silence. Then Winslow exhaled, the sound heavy. "Yes, briefly." "What about?" Another pause. "Something that no longer matters." And there it was. The kind of answer that meant it did matter, but Captain Winslow had spent years hiding truths behind rigid posture and military control. Bascom wasn't going to get much more out of him than that. But Miss Marple, she intended to. As the interviews ended, Miss Marple folded her embroidery neatly and rose, smoothing the front of her dress. She already had several pieces of the puzzle, though none of them had slotted together quite yet. Bradshaw had been playing a dangerous game, but who had finally decided to end it? Lady Helena had lied about something, though she'd been careful enough to make it seem like nothing. Edward's alibi was paper-thin, and thin alibis often meant there was something more underneath. Winslow was holding back, but that wasn't unusual for a man who had spent his life keeping secrets. And Dorothy, well, Dorothy had known something, and now she was gone. Miss Marple stepped into the hallway, the morning light casting long shadows against the marble floors. She didn't know who had killed Bradshaw, not yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Everyone in this house was hiding something. The morning had brought thin sunlight and thick tension, the kind of morning that hung in a house like stale perfume, unshaken, unmoved, steeped in whatever had happened the night before. Breakfast had been a silent affair, broken only by the clink of cutlery and the occasional forced pleasantry. Miss Marple had watched the room with mild interest, her hands resting lightly around her teacup, her mind moving in places no one else could see. Now the guests had scattered, some lingering in the drawing-room, others retreating to contemplate their own innocence in private. Miss Marple, however, had no use for contemplation. She had things to discover. The house was built for elegance, not secrecy, but that never stopped people from trying. Miss Marple had long ago learnt that conspiracies were best overheard near half-closed doors. So when she stepped into the west corridor and caught the hushed, urgent voices of Lady Helena and Edward Fairchild spilling from the study, she did what any sensible woman would do. She paused. "You don't understand." Edward's voice was tight, clipped, the kind of whisper that wasn't meant to calm but to warn. "This is bigger than me, Mother. Bigger than all of us." A pause. Then Lady Helena's voice, low but sharp. "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you let yourself be bought." Miss Marple's hand, resting lightly against the banister, did not move. "Do you think I wanted this?" Edward hissed. "Do you think I asked to be—" He exhaled sharply. "Bradshaw was supposed to fix it, keep it quiet. Now he's—" Silence. The kind that carried weight, the kind that only fell between two people who both knew the end of a sentence but refused to say it, dead. That was the word they weren't saying. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind filed the moment away, tucking it neatly beside all the other little oddities and half-truths. Lady Helena spoke again, softer now, but no less urgent. "We will not be made a scandal, Edward. Do you hear me? There is too much at stake." "Campaign funds," Edward muttered. "Blackmail. If this gets out—" Miss Marple stepped away, her footsteps light against the wooden floors. She had heard enough for now. There was a saying about power, that it was best kept out of reach lest it fall into the wrong hands. She rather thought Edward Fairchild had already dropped it, and now someone had picked it up and pointed it straight at his back. Dorothy's attic quarters were the kind of place people forgot existed. Tucked away at the top of a narrow, twisting staircase, it was a world apart from the grandeur below, the kind of room meant for people who weren't supposed to be noticed. Miss Marple stepped inside. The bed was neatly made, the small writing desk bare save for a folded apron and a single hairpin, a girl who had left in a hurry, but not without care. Or not under her own power at all. She moved with careful efficiency, her fingers tracing along the edges of the modest furnishings. There was a rhythm to these things, to where people chose to hide their secrets. She found it on the third floorboard from the dresser, just a hair looser than the others. She knelt, pried it up, and pulled out a small notebook. The pages were filled with sharp, meticulous handwriting, each line packed with a careful kind of urgency. Numbers, names, and at the bottom of one page, scrawled in dark ink, "C." Miss Marple's lips pursed. People often mistook neatness for innocence. But a notebook like this didn't belong to a simple maid with no business knowing the affairs of the powerful. Dorothy had known something, and now she was missing. Miss Marple closed the book, her fingers resting on the worn leather cover. A girl like Dorothy didn't just disappear. She was either hiding or she had been taken, and if it was the latter, then someone in Meadowbank Hall had already decided she wouldn't be coming back. Act 2. Gathering Secrets. By midday afternoon, Meadowbank Hall had settled into a hush that wasn't quite peaceful. It was the silence of a place that knew too much had been said already. Miss Marple, however, was not finished listening. She found Mrs. Patterson in the servants' corridor, straightening a shelf of silverware with the focused precision of a woman who needed to keep her hands busy. "I imagine it's been a rather difficult morning," Miss Marple said, her voice light, almost conversational. Oh, Mrs. Patterson's fingers hesitated over a teapot just for a second before she turned. "Can't say it's the worst I've seen," she muttered. "Oh, murder does put a damper on the household, doesn't it?" Miss Marple gave a gentle hum, the kind that could be mistaken for agreement or simple patience. "She's still missing, then?" Mrs. Patterson exhaled sharply, setting down a serving spoon with too much force. "Dorothy—" A pause. "Aye, and that's what's worrying me most." Miss Marple let her silence do the asking. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. Then, with a furtive glance toward the empty hall, she lowered her voice. "She had secrets, that girl," she said. "Not the usual ones, none of that foolish nonsense with the footmen. She was careful, always listening. Listening to what? Conversations she shouldn't have been near. And she was on the telephone late at night. Hushed voice. Kept saying things like evidence and payment details." Mrs. Patterson's mouth pressed into a thin line. "No maid should be talking like that. No, they shouldn't." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against her skirt. "So she wasn't just an ordinary maid." Mrs. Patterson snorted, dry and humourless. "Ordinary maids don't vanish the same night a man gets a bullet in his chest." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, I suppose they don't." The dining room at Meadowbank was built for entertaining, but tonight it might as well have been a burial chamber. The candelabra flickered, throwing soft gold light over crystal glasses and untouched plates. Lady Helena sat at the head of the table, her posture regal, her expression determinedly composed. It was the kind of composure that didn't invite discussion, so much as it dared someone to test it. No one did. Not at first. Miss Marple took her seat quietly, her gaze flicking over the remaining guests. Captain Winslow was stiff, barely touching his food. His eyes kept flicking toward Lady Helena, as if trying to gauge her mood. Edward Fairchild, on the other hand, was restless, his irritation bleeding through the thin veneer of civility. His glass sat half full, his fork motionless on his plate. He had the look of a man trapped in a game he no longer wanted to play. Conversation stumbled along in fragments, carefully avoiding the gaping absence at the table. It wasn't until Lady Helena, in a tone too smooth to be natural, inquired about Edward's upcoming political engagement, that the tension twisted. Edward set his glass down too hard, the sound sharp against the quiet. "Is now really the time, Mother?" Lady Helena's brows lifted just slightly, the only sign she'd even heard the irritation in his voice. "Life doesn't stop for grief, Edward." A beat. Then, in a cooler tone, "Or scandal." Miss Marple saw it. The way Captain Winslow's hand twitched toward his napkin, the way Edward's jaw clenched. Scandal. That was what this dinner was about. Control. Keeping the house standing even as the foundation cracked beneath it. She reached for her teacup, cracked beneath it. She reached for her teacup, taking a slow sip, watching as the silent war played out across the table. A house like Meadowbank Hall didn't fall from outside attacks. It crumbled from the inside. And as far as Miss Marple could tell, the walls were already buckling. Meadowbank Hall had the sort of stillness at night that wasn't quite peaceful. It was the silence of a place too used to secrets, where the walls had absorbed a century of whispers and held on to them like unpaid debts. Miss Marple, never one to sleep soundly in a house where people were pretending not to watch each other, found herself awake at an indecent hour. She slid out of bed, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the corridor. The hall was a tunnel of shadows, the dim glow from the wall sconces casting long fingers of light against the wood panelling. She didn't expect to hear anything, but then a faint sound, not the creak of old floorboards under a servant's careful steps, nor the sigh of wind against the leaded windows. So she followed it, padding softly down the corridor, past the great staircase toward the library. Light spilled out from beneath the door. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A light left burning in an empty room was one thing. A light accompanied by the faint scrape of drawers being opened and shut was quite another. She stepped forward, just enough to ease the door open. Inside, Captain Winslow was bent over the great mahogany desk, one hand buried in the open drawer, the other resting tensely on the polished surface. His face was set in a grim concentration, his movements careful but quick, the movements of a man searching for something he didn't want anyone to know he needed. Miss Marple, polite as ever, cleared her throat. Captain Winslow froze. Then, with the smooth efficiency of a man used to improvising, he straightened and turned, offering her a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Couldn't sleep either, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple stepped fully into the room, her expression mild, her voice pleasantly unconvinced. "Not the wink," she said. "But I do find a bit of fresh air helps." She glanced at the open drawer. "Or I suppose a bit of light reading." Winslow relaxed his stance, leaning back against the desk as if he had all the time in the world. "Nothing as entertaining as that, I'm afraid," he said, reaching for an easy smile. "I misplaced a key. Thought I might have left it in here." Miss Marple's gaze drifted down to the drawer, neatly lined with documents, but no sign of rummaging for a key. "Dear me," she said, letting just a hint of skepticism colour her tone. "What a bother. And did you find it?" Winslow's hesitation was fractional but noticeable. "No," he said smoothly. "But I'm sure it'll turn up somewhere." He closed the drawer with calculated nonchalance. Miss Marple let her eyes wander over the desk, noting the way his shoulders shifted ever so slightly to block a particular section of it from view. And then she saw it. Just beneath the polished brass lamp, near the carved edge of the desk, was a hairline crack in the wood. The subtle seam where the grain didn't quite match, a concealed compartment, and Winslow, for all his practised ease, was carefully avoiding it. Miss Marple's fingers tightened lightly around her shawl. "Misplacing things is always a trouble," she said lightly, "especially in a house with so many places to hide them." Winslow's expression didn't change, but his eyes, just for a flicker of a second, narrowed. A fraction of a moment, but Miss Marple saw it. She smiled, stepping back toward the door. "I shan't disturb you further, Captain. I do hope you find what you're looking for." Winslow inclined his head. "I always do," he said. Miss Marple didn't doubt it, but she had the distinct feeling that what he was looking for had very little to do with a missing key. By morning, Meadowbank Hall had settled into a tense sort of routine, the way a house does when everyone inside it is pretending they haven't spent the night considering who among them might be a murderer. Miss Marple had just finished buttoning her cardigan when there was a knock at her door. Sharp, deliberate, the kind of knock a man gives when he isn't entirely sure he should be there. She opened it to find Captain Winslow, looking as though he had already been awake for hours and had spent most of them thinking about things he'd rather not be thinking about. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "might I have a word?" She stepped aside, gesturing toward the small armchair near the window. Winslow hesitated, then sat, his posture as stiff as if he were still in uniform, his hands clasped too tightly together. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said after a moment. Miss Marple sat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Goodness, Captain, you do sound guilty of something." He let out a short, humorless chuckle, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "No," he said. "Just cautious." He exhaled slowly. "It's Lady Helena," he said finally. "I'm worried about her." Miss Marple said nothing, just let the silence settle, let him find his own way into the confession. "Bradshaw was trouble," Winslow continued. "The sort of man who collected secrets the way others collect fine cigars. He had leverage on Edward. Something about campaign funds, land deals, hush money." His jaw tightened. "And now he's dead." Miss Marple's eyes flickered, catching the subtle note beneath his voice. "You think Edward killed him?" Winslow hesitated. "I think Edward had every reason to, but I don't know if that means he actually did." Miss Marple studied him, her expression placid, unreadable. Winslow wasn't here for justice. He was here because protecting Lady Helena mattered more to him than uncovering the truth. If shielding her meant holding back a crucial piece of evidence, she suspected he would do it without hesitation, and that was interesting, because in Miss Marple's experience, a man who was willing to protect someone at all costs was just as dangerous as the man who had something to hide. Winslow left shortly after, his confession incomplete, his loyalties painfully transparent. Miss Marple, however, had her own business to attend to. It led her back to the library, where the morning light filtered through the tall windows in narrow golden streaks, making the mahogany desk glow like something alive. She moved carefully, her fingers trailing lightly along the grain, finding the thin seam Winslow had so pointedly ignored the night before. A concealed compartment. She pressed against it gently. There was a faint click, and then a panel shifted open, revealing a bundle of documents neatly folded inside. Miss Marple removed them with care, unfolding the brittle pages, scanning the contents with the patience of a woman who had spent her life understanding the things people tried to keep hidden. What she found was damning. Land development rights, approved under suspicious circumstances, campaign donations, large sums moved quietly through unknown sources, a significant amount of money, all traced back to Edward Fairchild. Miss Marple pursed her lips. This wasn't just an unfortunate business arrangement. This was a cover-up, a bribe, a scandal waiting to be unearthed. And Bradshaw had known Dorothy too, she realized. The hidden notebook, the late-night calls, the whispered mentions of evidence and payments. Dorothy had been piecing this together the same way Miss Marple was doing now, and someone had made sure she didn't live long enough to finish the puzzle. Miss Marple folded the papers carefully, tucking them back where she found them. Then she straightened, smoothed the front of her skirt, and stepped toward the door. She had seen enough, and now it was time to see who else knew. Miss Marple had always believed that paperwork was where crimes truly lived. Murders might happen in libraries or drawing rooms, but scandals were buried in ledgers, folded into official reports, and tucked away in the fine print of contracts. That was why she had spent the last hour in the quiet solitude of the library, sifting through the documents hidden inside the desk's concealed compartment. Among the land development contracts and hushed campaign donations, one particular file caught her eye: council appropriations. The name was vague enough to seem mundane, but Miss Marple had been around long enough to know that any official-sounding phrase could be a smokescreen for something far murkier. She flipped through the pages, her fingers moving with careful precision, and then she found it. Tucked inside an index of financial transactions, a series of payments under a nondescript code, C.A. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes narrowing. C.A. Dorothy's notebook had mentioned those initials repeatedly, always alongside references to bribes, fund transfers, and hush payments. She exhaled slowly. Dorothy Matthews had not just been a maid, she had been an investigator, placed inside Meadowbank Hall for a purpose. And now she was gone. Miss Marple pursed her lips. If Dorothy had uncovered this, then her disappearance wasn't just a consequence of bad luck. It was a deliberate act. A girl like Dorothy didn't just vanish, she was silenced. And that raised a rather uncomfortable question. Had she been silenced because of what she knew? Or had she been silenced because someone in this house had discovered who she really was? Miss Marple was just tucking the documents back into their hiding place when she heard the heavy footsteps of a man who was already annoyed before the conversation even started. She glanced up as Inspector Bascom entered the library. He had the look of a man who had spent the last several hours being asked the same question by too many people and had found all of them equally irritating. Miss Marple, however, had long ago learned that irritation was simply the cousin of curiosity. Bascom folded his arms. "You've been busy?" he said flatly. Miss Marple gave a mild smile, tucking her hands neatly in front of her. "I do like to keep my mind occupied," Bascom exhaled, rubbing at his temple. I'll give you this, Miss Marple, you're thorough. But let me be clear, this is a police matter, and I don't need you stirring up a hornet's nest when I'm trying to keep this investigation controlled." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her eyes gleamed just slightly. "Oh, I quite agree, Inspector," she said. "Murder is, after all, a most inconvenient thing." Bascom narrowed his eyes. "Don't play coy with me," he said. "You've been asking questions, getting into things that aren't your concern." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I might argue that a murderer on the loose in a house where I happen to be staying is very much my concern." Bascom sighed through his nose. There was a long pause, during which Miss Marple simply waited, and then, with visible reluctance, Bascom muttered, "All right. What do you know?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, just a few small things," she said lightly. "For instance, I believe Dorothy Matthews was not merely a maid, but an undercover investigator. I suspect she had been gathering evidence on campaign fraud and bribery, and I suspect that whoever murdered Lord Bradshaw either knew what she had discovered, or worse, knew who she really was." Bascom blinked. Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Now," she said pleasantly, "shall we compare notes?" The village of Little Eckford had a way of keeping its secrets, not by hiding them, but by dressing them up as gossip and letting them walk freely down the cobbled streets. Miss Marple had always understood this. She understood it as she stepped into the post office, where the air smelled of old paper and lavender sachets, and where Mrs. Edith Harcourt, the village postmistress, presided over her counter like a queen, indulging a rare audience. "Oh, Miss Marple, dear," Mrs. Harcourt said, eyes bright with curiosity. "We've all been hearing about the dreadful business at Meadowbank Hall. Terrible thing, simply terrible." Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves, gave a small, sympathetic nod. "Yes, quite dreadful," she agreed. "And the poor maid, Dorothy, vanished without a trace." Mrs. Harcourt sighed dramatically, resting her forearms on the counter. "Well, I can't say I knew her well, but she was polite enough. Always came in regular as clockwork to collect parcels, official-looking ones, too. Thought they were for the Fairchilds at first, but then I noticed she never had them delivered. Always took them herself." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly around the handle of her handbag. "Official-looking, you say?" Mrs. Harcourt nodded sagely, pleased to have an attentive audience. "They had that government seal on them, stamped right across the top, you know the sort, like you'd see on legal documents." She leaned in conspiratorially. "Not that I read people's mail, of course, but one does notice things." Miss Marple gave a gentle hum, her mind already arranging the pieces into a picture she didn't quite like the look of. Dorothy had been receiving official government documents, and if Mrs. Harcourt had noticed them, someone else might have too, which meant that Dorothy's disappearance wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of something much bigger. Miss Marple returned to Meadowbank Hall, stepping inside just as the telephone shrilled through the silence. A maid hurried forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand. She lifted the receiver, her voice pleasant and unassuming. "If Meadowbank Hall." A pause, then a voice, low, measured. "Has the package been delivered?" Miss Marple did not blink. She let the silence stretch, just enough to hear the faint tension in the caller's breathing. Then she said smoothly, "I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific." The line went very still. Then Miss Marple placed the receiver back with careful precision, her mind already working through the implications. The caller hadn't asked for a person, hadn't asked about Dorothy. They had asked about a package, which meant they weren't just looking for her. They were looking for what she had taken, and if Dorothy was still alive, she was not only in hiding, she was running out of time. Inspector Bascom had the look of a man who had already swallowed a bitter pill and was now being asked to chew it. He stood in the Meadowbank Hall study, arms folded, his sharp gaze flicking between the faded rug and the heavy drapes, as if the house itself might confess to murder if only he glared at it long enough. Miss Marple, seated neatly in a wing-back chair, waited with patient amusement. Finally Bascom sighed, running a hand over his moustache. "I suppose there's no sense keeping it quiet now," he muttered. "Not with you sniffing around." Miss Marple's smile was polite, but her eyes gleamed. Bascom straightened, squaring his shoulders like a man bracing himself for an unpleasant duty. "There's more to this than a simple murder," he admitted. "Word came down from London before Bradshaw was even cold. Government eyes have been on this place for months." Miss Marple's hand stilled over her knitting, the only indication that the statement had interested her in the slightest. Bascom exhaled, frustration evident in the hard set of his jaw. "They tipped us off about potential corruption. Funds moving where they shouldn't, backroom deals in places that look respectable on the outside. Someone up top suspected that Meadowbank Hall wasn't just a country estate hosting garden parties." He paused, giving Miss Marple a pointed look. "Now you're telling me Dorothy Matthews wasn't just a maid but an investigator?" Miss Marple's fingers resumed their quiet work, looping yarn over needles with steady practiced efficiency. "I suspect as much," she said lightly. "And if that's the case, her disappearance means she's either been silenced or she's still on the run," Bascom finished grimly. Miss Marple nodded. "And if she's still running," she mused, "then perhaps she's gathering the courage to come forward, assuming she can stay ahead of the murderer long enough to do so." Bascom muttered something under his breath that Miss Marple chose not to hear. Instead, she tucked away her knitting, folded her hands in her lap, and said pleasantly, "Well, Inspector, it seems we'll need to find her before someone else does." Bascom rubbed his temples. "Miss Marple," he said wearily, "you are the most exasperating woman I have ever met." Miss Marple beamed. "Oh, I do hope so." The dining room at Meadowbank Hall had taken on a peculiar quality that evening, as though it were playing host to a stage play where every actor knew his role, but none of them wanted to be on the stage. The meal was elegant, the silver gleaming under candlelight, but no one was eating. Instead, they were watching Edward Fairchild. Miss Marple noted it immediately. The way Lady Helena's fingers tightened around her wine-glass, the way Captain Winslow kept his eyes trained on his plate, the way Edward himself sat with restless, simmering energy, his gaze darting toward the doors as if he were already halfway out of them. Then, abruptly, he set his fork down with a deliberate clink. "I think," he said, in a voice carefully devoid of emotion, "that I ought to go to London." The words landed like a dropped knife, sharp and out of place. Lady Helena, who had been composed up until now, went rigid. "Absolutely not," she said. Edward exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. "This investigation is turning into a spectacle," he muttered. "People are asking questions, and I need to—" "You need to stay here," Lady Helena cut in smoothly, her tone like silk wrapped around steel. Edward's eyes flashed. "Mother!" "No." The word was soft, but it held the weight of finality. Edward sat back, looking like a man who had been placed in a gilded cage and had only just realized the door was locked from the outside. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Interesting. Edward was agitated, more than a man should be if he had nothing to run from. And Lady Helena, for all her grace and refinement, was not just advising him to stay, she was ordering it. Miss Marple took a delicate sip of her tea, her eyes twinkling over the rim. This was getting more interesting by the minute. The night had settled over Meadowbank Hall like a heavy quilt, thick with mist and silence. A lesser woman might have thought twice before wandering out into the damp, lantern-lit paths of the estate. Miss Marple was not a lesser woman. She moved quietly, her steps deliberate, the hem of her coat skimming along the dewy grass. The gardener's shed stood at the farthest edge of the property, tucked away behind the yew hedges, forgotten by everyone except the mice that had taken up residence in the rafters. And, it seemed, by Dorothy Matthews. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for a flicker of candlelight to slip through the crack. Miss Marple knocked, slightly but firmly. Inside something rustled. Then a sharp inhale, a breath held too long. "Dorothy," Miss Marple said, keeping her voice gentle but certain. "It's over now. Come out, my dear." Silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open wider, revealing a pale, trembling girl with wide, hollow eyes. Dorothy Matthews had never been one for frills. but she looked stripped down to her bones now, her dress torn, her hair loose, her skin smudged with dirt and fear. For a moment she just stared, as if unsure whether Miss Marple was real. Then, with a shuddering breath, she sagged against the door-frame. "I thought I was dead," she whispered. Miss Marple stepped forward, carefully wrapping the girl in the warmth of her shawl, as though smoothing over the jagged edges of the last 2 days. "Tell me," she said softly. Dorothy swallowed. "I saw him do it," she whispered. "I saw Edward shoot Lord Bradshaw." Miss Marple didn't move. She simply listened, as she had always done best. Dorothy clutched the shawl tighter around herself. I knew something was wrong," she said. "I'd been keeping records. Government documents, payments, things that didn't add up. I was supposed to report it, but I needed more proof. She exhaled sharply. "And then that night I heard voices in the library. I hid in the hall just outside the door. I wasn't supposed to be there." She looked away, hands twisting into the fabric of her skirt. "Bradshaw was laughing," she whispered, "telling Edward he had everything he needed to ruin him. The bribery, the land deals. 'Not even your mother can save you now,' he said." Dorothy swallowed hard. "Edward begged him to make a deal, to let him fix it. But Bradshaw—" He just smiled. "No, dear boy," he said. "I don't think you understand. This isn't a negotiation." Dorothy took a breath, bracing herself against the memory. "Then I heard the gunshot." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm, though she could feel the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place like a final lock turning. Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "I ran. I knew if he found me, I'd be next." She lifted her chin slightly, something hard glinting in her exhausted eyes. "But I have it, Miss Marple," she said. "The proof, the documents, the payments, the evidence. Enough to put Edward behind bars. For corruption." She paused. "For murder." Miss Marple reached forward, smoothing a reassuring hand over the girl's trembling fingers. "Well," she said mildly, "I do think it's time we delivered the final act, don't you?" Dorothy exhaled, like a woman who had been holding her breath for far too long, and in the distance the first faint traces of morning light began to creep over Meadowbank Hall. Miss Marple had always believed that truth, like a well-brewed pot of tea, required just the right amount of patience and timing. Too soon, and it was bitter. Too late, and it lost its strength. And now, as she sat in the dim gardener's shed with Dorothy Matthews, a girl who had spent 2 days running for her life, she knew that the time had come to serve the truth while it was still piping hot. Dorothy was still pale, her hands tight around the shawl Miss Marple had draped over her shoulders, but there was a steadiness in her now, a flicker of resolve beneath the exhaustion. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to the tone of a conspirator. "You must trust Inspector Bascom," she said. "We need to bring this into the open. On our terms, not Edward Fairchild's." Dorothy hesitated, then exhaled through her nose. "I don't trust the police," she admitted. "I've seen too many cases brushed under the rug." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "Oh, I quite agree," she said. "But Bascom is a man who dislikes looking foolish more than he dislikes corruption. If we give him the truth in front of an audience, he won't be able to ignore it." Dorothy frowned, chewing her lip. "And Edward?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed slightly, the closest she ever came to real satisfaction. "We set the stage properly," she said, "and Edward Fairchild will tie the noose around his own neck. Inspector Bascom was not a man who enjoyed surprises." When Miss Marple and Dorothy arrived at his makeshift command post in the study, he was halfway through a lukewarm cup of tea in a sour mood. "I knew you'd bring trouble," he muttered, setting down his cup as Miss Marple entered, Dorothy half hidden behind her. Miss Marple beamed pleasantly. "Oh, Inspector, you mustn't give me so much credit," she said. "I simply listen, and occasionally people tell me very useful things." Bascom's gaze flicked to Dorothy, who lifted her chin slightly, but Miss Marple caught the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "I have proof," Dorothy said. "About the bribes, the land deals. Edward killed Bradshaw to keep it quiet. Bascom's mouth tightened, but his eyes sharpened. Miss Marple pressed on. "We need to confront him in front of everyone," she said. "If we do it privately, Lady Helena will protect him and we lose our chance. We need a public reckoning." Bascom grunted. "You mean a spectacle?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I do love a good finale." After a long silence, Bascom exhaled and pushed back his chair. "Fine," he muttered. "Library, first thing in the morning. We'll make it look like routine questioning." Miss Marple smiled. "Wonderful," she said. "Now then, let's ensure we have all the necessary props." The hallways of Meadowbank Hall were hushed in the early hours, the grand house holding its breath before dawn. Dorothy had been safely hidden away, and Miss Marple had one final task before the morning's gathering, ensuring the evidence remained untouched. She slipped into the library, the air still thick with the scent of tobacco and old books, her keen eyes sweeping the room. The hidden compartment in the desk, the one that had held the incriminating documents, remained sealed. Good. But then, movement. Miss Marple stilled, blending into the shadows. A figure stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders squared in tension. Captain Winslow. He was pacing in short, sharp movements, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Miss Marple stepped forward lightly, her voice calm, curious. "Up rather early, aren't you, Captain?" Winslow didn't startle. Instead he turned, meeting her gaze with a grim sort of resignation. "Couldn't sleep," he muttered. "Seems I'm not the only one." Miss Marple studied him for a moment. "You're worried about Lady Helena?" It wasn't a question. Winslow exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "She's about to lose everything," he said. "Whether or not she deserves it, that's not for me to say." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And Edward?" Winslow's jaw tightened. "He's on his own," he said, "and I suspect he knows it." Miss Marple gave a gentle nod, as though acknowledging a silent understanding. "Well, Captain," she said, smoothing the front of her coat, "we'll know soon enough how this all ends." Winslow's shoulders straightened, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said, "I suppose we will." And as Miss Marple left the library, the dawn light spilling through the windows, she had the distinct feeling that, by the end of the morning, Meadowbank Hall would never be the same again. The library at Meadowbank Hall had taken on a different character that morning. Gone was the usual air of old wealth and quiet authority. Now it felt like something heavy, something watchful, like the very walls remembered what had happened here 2 nights ago. Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression serene as ever. Beside her, Inspector Bascom stood, arms crossed, his usual irritation tempered by something closer to anticipation. The guests had arrived as instructed, though none looked particularly pleased about it. Lady Helena was seated with meticulous poise, her gloved hands resting lightly on the arm of her chair, though the tension in her jaw belied her calm demeanour. Edward Fairchild sat across from her, looking every bit the politician who had found himself in a room full of people he didn't trust. He was pale, stiff, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of the chair's armrest. Captain Winslow, still carrying himself like a soldier even out of uniform, stood near the bookshelves, arms behind his back, his face unreadable. And Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, was hovering near the door, her fingers clutching at the fabric of her apron like she'd rather be anywhere else. Miss Marple's gaze flickered over each of them before she spoke. "Well," she said pleasantly, "shall we begin?" No one answered, so she began anyway. "When Lord Bradshaw was murdered," Miss Marple said, "it seemed at first to be a crime of power, the result of a man who had made too many enemies, but as I began to listen, to observe, a different picture emerged." She turned to Edward, her eyes keen, though her smile remained gentle. "You were under considerable pressure, weren't you, Mr. Fairchild?" Edward didn't move, but the muscles in his neck tensed just slightly. Miss Marple continued, unfazed. "I spoke with Mrs. Patterson," she said, "and she told me something interesting. That Dorothy, your missing maid, had been receiving official documents through the post. At first it seemed peculiar, but then I discovered her notebook." Edward's fingers stopped drumming. Miss Marple gave a pleasant nod, as if she were merely discussing the weather. "Yes, a very thorough girl, Dorothy. She had been taking notes. About your financial dealings, your campaign funds, the secret ledger hidden in your desk compartment." She turned slightly toward Bascom, who produced the notebook from his coat pocket and set it on the desk with a quiet thud. Edward's face went very still. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice lowering slightly, drawing them all in. "You were paying Bradshaw hush money," she said. "To keep quiet about illicit campaign funds, land deals made under the table, a corruption scheme that, if exposed, would have ruined you." She turned her attention briefly to Lady Helena, whose fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "I imagine," Miss Marple continued, "Lady Helena had spent considerable time ensuring her son's political ambitions remained untainted, but Bradshaw," she exhaled, "was not a man easily satisfied." Edward exhaled sharply, his first real movement since she had started speaking. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And that night he demanded more, didn't he?" Edward didn't answer. So she answered for him. "You went to the library late that evening," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Perhaps to reason with him, perhaps to offer him more money. But Bradshaw saw your desperation. He laughed at you." She turned, glancing toward the rug, as though picturing the exact moment. "Who told you he was going to ruin you anyway?" She paused. "And that," she said softly, "is when you reached for the gun." The room was silent. Then Edward let out a breathless chuckle. "That's a fascinating theory," he said, though his voice was strained, forced. Miss Marple simply tilted her head. "Oh, it's more than a theory, Mr. Fairchild." She nodded toward Bascom, who stepped forward, withdrawing a small stack of papers from his pocket. Bascom's expression was grim. "These were found in the hidden compartment of your desk," he said. "Finalized payments, false accounting records, all tied back to you." Edward's eyes flicked toward the papers, then back to the room, calculating. Lady Helena breathed in sharply. Miss Marple waited. Edward shifted in his chair, reaching for some kind of rebuttal, some excuse that might still salvage his name. Then a voice from the doorway. "You're finished, Edward." Dorothy Matthews stood just inside the library, her frame thin but steady, her eyes burning with the weight of everything she had seen. The last piece had fallen into place. And Edward Fairchild, for the first time since this had begun, looked afraid. Miss Marple simply smoothed the folds of her skirt, her work, at last, done. Dorothy Matthews stepped into the library, her frame thin but unyielding, her hands clutching a stack of worn documents, the edges creased from too many nights of being hidden, handled, and feared. The room shifted around her, a collection of aristocratic postures, tight jaws, and controlled reactions. Edward Fairchild sat very still. Lady Helena's composure cracked just slightly, her fingers clenching against the armrest of her chair. Captain Winslow exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering toward the young woman standing at the threshold like a spectre of the past, come back to claim its due. Dorothy didn't falter. "I saw it," she said, voice clear despite the exhaustion lining her features. "He saw Edward shoot Lord Bradshaw." A ripple of cold realization ran through the room. Miss Marple, seated serenely near the hearth, folded her hands in her lap, watching the last pieces fall into place. Dorothy took a breath, her eyes burning as she locked onto Edward. "You wanted to buy more time," she said, "to find another way out. But Bradshaw, he wasn't letting you off easy, was he?" Edward's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Dorothy pressed on. "I was outside the library," she continued, her voice steady, controlled. "I heard everything." She glanced toward the desk where Bradshaw had once stood, where his life had been bargained for and ultimately taken. "He was laughing at you," she murmured. Telling you there was no escape, no deal, that he was going to expose everything, the bribes, the campaign funds, the land scandal, and then you panicked." Edward's fingers twitched. Dorothy lifted the documents she held. "These are the financial records Bradshaw was holding over your head," she said. "The same ones I've been collecting. I didn't steal them. I found them. You left them behind in your rush after the murder." She stepped forward, the light catching the dark circles under her eyes, the determination in her stance. "I ran because I knew you'd kill me too if you got the chance." Edward's face remained unreadable, but his fingers gripped the arms of his chair too tightly, the knuckles white. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, watching him. She had seen this moment before. The precise moment a guilty man decided whether to fight or fold. For a long moment Edward said nothing. Then he laughed, a low, bitter sound, as though some unseen force had played a cruel joke at his expense. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, detached, like a man already lost. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said. Lady Helena inhaled sharply. Edward didn't look at her. "Bradshaw? He wouldn't stop," he continued. "I thought I could talk him down. I thought—" He let out a slow, shuddering breath. "But he was never going to stop." His gaze lifted, finding Miss Marple as though she were the only one in the room who might understand the weight of his words. "I saw no way out," he admitted. "I panicked. I pulled the trigger before I even knew what I was doing." The library held its breath. "And then I tried to clean it up." Another voice cut in, rough with guilt. All heads turned. Captain Winslow had gone pale, his usual composure slipping for the first time. "I didn't know, not at first," he said hoarsely. I thought it might have been an accident, or self-defense, or something that could be covered up." Edward turned his head, blinking in muted shock. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "And so," she said, "you tampered with the crime scene." Winslow nodded stiffly. "I took the bullet casing," he admitted. "Thought if the scene looked cleaner, the police might look in another direction, but I didn't realize—" His voice trailed off. "I didn't realize just how deep it all went." The admission hung in the air. Edward, for all his calculating self-preservation, looked truly lost for the first time. Lady Helena, silent until now, let out a quiet, fractured breath. She turned to Edward with something unreadable in her expression. "You were supposed to be better than this," she whispered. Edward closed his eyes. Inspector Bascom cleared his throat, stepping forward, his presence solid, final. "Edward Fairchild," he said, his voice steady, "you are under arrest for the murder of Lord Peter Bradshaw." There was no protest, no last-minute bargaining. Edward simply stood, his face hollowed out by exhaustion. Lady Helena's shoulders shook, just once, before Captain Winslow placed a steadying hand on her arm. Edward turned to his mother, something flickering behind his expression. But whatever he wanted to say, he never got the chance. Bascom clicked the handcuffs closed. Edward was led away. Dorothy, still clutching the incriminating papers, let out a breath she had been holding for far too long. Miss Marple watched, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room one last time, taking in the wreckage of greed, power, and desperation. Another crime solved, another life unravelled by its own choices and consequences. She smoothed the front of her dress, her voice gentle but firm. "Well," she said, glancing at the others, "I do believe that settles the matter." And with that, the great house of Meadowbank Hall finally fell silent. Justice served a week later. The newspapers had their feast. "Scandal at Meadowbank Hall. Fairchild heir charged with murder and fraud. Lord Bradshaw murder case exposed political corruption. Missing maid turns in brutal." Edward Fairchild's fall from grace had been swift and brutal. The murder charge alone had been enough to shatter his reputation, but it was the fraud, the intricate web of bribery and land deals, that turned his public disgrace into a national spectacle. Dorothy Matthews had handed over her findings to the government watchdog agency. What had started as a discreet investigation into political corruption had ended with a corpse on a Persian rug and a family legacy in ruins. Lady Helena, once the iron-willed matriarch of Meadowbank Hall, had withdrawn from public life entirely. The estate, once a symbol of power and prestige, was now just a house filled with ghosts and bad memories. Captain Winslow had quietly left England, retreating to a distant cousin's home in Scotland. Whether out of shame or duty, he had stood by Lady Helena even as her world collapsed around her. Inspector Bascom, begrudgingly, had earned some praise for the case. Though he would never admit it, he owed much of the success to one particular old woman with a knack for seeing through pretense. Miss Marple, however, had no interest in headlines or accolades. She had already gone home. Back in St. Mary Mead, life had resumed its quiet rhythms. Miss Marple sat in her rose garden, a pair of shears in hand, trimming back wayward branches while the morning sunlight played over the petals. She wasn't one for dwelling, and yet this case lingered. The documents Dorothy had uncovered hinted at something bigger, a broader network of corporate and political conspirators beyond Meadowbank Hall. Men who had stayed in the shadows, using people like Bradshaw and Edward as disposable pawns. Miss Marple knew that justice moved slowly, like a river carving its way through stone. It would take time, more names would surface, more truths would be unearthed. But that was the way of things. She set down her shears, dusted the soil from her fingers, and reached for her teacup. A sparrow flitted past the garden hedge. A neighbour's dog barked in the distance. And Miss Marple, content, observant, ever watchful, sipped her tea, letting the world turn as it always did. But truth, even if slow, always found its way to the surface, and that, she thought, was enough for now.